Over the next few weeks, the situation grew worse. Greg sent formal letters on official HOA stationery, each one more demanding than the last. The papers arrived in John's mailbox daily, stamped with red ink that screamed urgent and final note I see. John's wife started collecting these letters in a shoebox, convinced they might need them later as evidence. One afternoon, while John was fixing a broken gate, he spotted an unfamiliar car parked along the road near his property. The driver seemed to be taking photos of his fence. When John approached, the car sped away, leaving a trail of dust down the gravel road. This happened 3 more times that week, always with different vehicles, always with people taking pictures. Thomas, the dairy farmer next door, noticed too. "Those aren't locals," he said during one of their evening chats by the fence line. The old man spat tobacco juice into the dirt and shook his head. "Greg's bringing in outside people to strengthen his case. He's even talking about hiring a lawyer." The tension spread through their small community like wildfire. At the local diner, conversation stopped when John walked in. Some folks nodded sympathetically, while others turned away, too afraid to take sides. The waitress, who had served John coffee every morning for 15 years, now avoided eye contact as she poured his usual order. During the next HOA meeting, the room buzzed with nervous energy. Folding chairs squeaked as neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Greg stood at the front with his presentation board covered in satellite images, property surveys, and highlighted rulebooks. He spoke for 20 minutes about community standards and property values. John tried to remain calm, but his knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the table. When his turn came to speak, he stood slowly, his shadow stretching across the room. "This isn't about rules," he said quietly. "This is about a man trying to push people around because he can." After the meeting, as people filed out into the parking lot, Greg approached John. Under the dim parking lot lights, his face looked different, harder somehow. "You have 30 days to remove that fence," he said, holding up a thick envelope, "or I'll file an injunction with the county court." That night, John couldn't sleep. He sat on his porch, listening to the crickets and watching his horses rest peacefully in the moonlit pasture. The fence stood there like a silent guardian, its weathered wood telling stories of decades past. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "A man's property is his kingdom, son, but kingdoms are only as strong as the people willing to defend them." By morning, John had made his decision. He would fight this, not just for the fence, but for the principle of fairness in their community. He didn't know then that the real battle was yet to come, or that help would arrive from the most unexpected source. Trough. Every town has that one neighbor who thinks they run the place. In this small Texas town, that neighbor was Greg Hutchins, a man with perfectly pressed shirts and a clipboard that never seemed to leave his hands. He'd moved in 3 years ago, fresh from the city, and immediately joined the homeowners association, climbing his way to board member within 6 months. John Miller had been living on his sprawling ranch for 22 years. The property sat on 50 acres of rolling hills, with horses grazing in the pastures and a small herd of sheep that his grandfather had started raising decades ago. It was the kind of place where the air smelled like fresh hay and morning coffee, where children could run barefoot through the grass without their parents worrying about cars or strangers. The trouble started on a Tuesday, right after the monthly HOA meeting. John had built a wooden split-rail fence back in 1992, long before anyone had even thought about creating a homeowners association in their rural community. That fence had weathered countless storms, survived 3 different droughts, and had never caused a single complaint from any of his neighbors. But Greg Hutchins saw things differently. He stood at the edge of John's property line with his measuring tape and clipboard, wearing a frown that could curdle milk. "This fence violates Section 4.7 of our community guidelines," he announced, tapping his pen against the clipboard for emphasis. John had been mucking out the stables when Greg arrived. He wiped his hands on his jeans and walked over, dust kicking up from his boots with each step. The morning sun painted everything in golden hues, and mockingbirds sang from the nearby oak trees, completely unaware of the brewing conflict. "That fence has been here since before most of these houses were built," John explained patiently, "the way you might tell a child why they can't have ice cream for breakfast. My father helped me put it up when I was 25 years old. We used wood from trees that fell during that big storm you probably heard about in the news back then." Greg's face turned the color of a ripe tomato. His city shoes sank slightly into the soft earth as he shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the rural setting. "The rules apply to everyone equally," he insisted, adjusting his glasses. "No exceptions, no grandfathering, no excuses." The conversation grew heated, attracting the attention of John's dairy farming neighbor, Thomas, who was checking his mailbox across the road. Thomas wandered over, his weathered face creasing with concern as he overheard the dispute. Soon, word spread through the community about the fence argument, dividing neighbors who had once shared Sunday barbecues and helped each other during harvest season. What started as a simple disagreement began to consume their small town. Some residents sided with John, remembering the days before the HOA when neighbors settled disputes over coffee and handshakes. Others supported Greg, believing that rules existed for good reason and should be followed by everyone, regardless of history. The evening birdsong suddenly stopped. In that unnatural silence, John noticed something strange about the sheep pasture. The gate he checked that morning stood wide open, and his prize ram, Brutus, was nowhere to be seen. The big sheep had a habit of wandering off when gates weren't properly secured, and usually ended up near the barn looking for extra feed. "Actually, Greg," John said, his mind racing, "you might want to leave through the front gate. Sometimes the animals get protective when visitors stay too late." Greg dismissed the warning with a wave of his hand. "I've had enough of your threats, Miller." He turned to face John directly, and that's when John saw it clearly. The unmistakable outline of a firearm tucked beneath Greg's shirt. "I've tried being civil," Greg continued, his voice shaking with anger. "I've tried following proper channels. But you leave me no choice." His hand moved with deliberate slowness to lift his shirt, revealing a black pistol holstered at his hip. John's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. "Let's think about this, Greg. Put that away, and we can talk like reasonable people." "There's nothing to talk about," Greg snapped, fully drawing the weapon now. The metal gleamed in the fading sunlight. "You have two choices. Agree to remove the fence immediately, or I press charges for harassment and intimidation. The HOA has collected statements from witnesses about your threatening behavior at meetings." Jose, still watching from the barn entrance, reached slowly for his cell phone in his back pocket. His weathered hands, calloused from years of ranch work, fumbled slightly as he tried to dial without drawing attention. The standoff stretched into uncomfortable seconds. John could smell the approaching storm on the breeze, could feel the shift in air pressure that meant rain was coming. A small voice in his head reminded him about Brutus's timing. The ram always came back for his evening feed around this hour, especially when thunder threatened. Greg's grip on the weapon tightened. "I'm not playing games anymore. This community needs order, and I'm the one who's going to bring it." That's when they heard it. The sound of hooves on hard-packed earth, growing louder with each second. Brutus had indeed returned from his afternoon adventure, and he was approaching fast. The massive ram, weighing nearly 300 pounds, was probably just excited about dinner. But to someone unfamiliar with farm animals, the charging sheep would look like pure danger. Greg's head snapped toward the sound. In a split second of panic, he shifted his aim from John to the approaching animal. The black barrel now pointed into the gathering darkness where Brutus was gaining speed. John's mind reacted before his body could. Everything that happened next unfolded like a scene from a movie, each detail searing itself into his memory. The setting sun cast long shadows across the ranch. The distant thunder rumbled closer. And Brutus, completely unaware of the drama he was interrupting, continued his determined charge toward what he considered his rightful dinner time. The following weeks brought surprising changes to their small community. News of the incident spread beyond the town limits when the local newspaper, the Valley Weekly, picked up the story. The headline read, "HOA dispute ends in horse trough after Ram's intervention." Within days, it became a viral sensation on social media, with people sharing the bizarre tale across the country. Greg faced serious criminal charges and was removed from the HOA board immediately. The emergency meeting called by remaining board members lasted 3 hours, filled with angry residents demanding accountability. Many who had quietly supported Greg's strict rule enforcement now distanced themselves, realizing how far things had gone. John hired a property rights attorney with his savings, expecting a long legal battle. But something unexpected happened during the first consultation. The attorney, Mrs. Williams, smiled when reviewing John's documents. "This fence was built in 1992, correct? The HOA was established in 2006. You have what we call a non-conforming use right, essentially grandfathered protection." The legal victory came swiftly. Within 2 weeks, the HOA received an official letter from Mrs. Williams' firm. The fence was protected by law, and any further attempts to force its removal would result in legal action against the association. The HOA board voted unanimously to settle with John, covering all his legal fees and guaranteeing permanent protection for his fence. However, the most remarkable change wasn't legal, it was cultural. The community that had once divided over the fence dispute now came together to support John's family. Thomas organized a neighborhood barbecue where stories flowed as freely as the sweet tea. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in months found themselves laughing together again. Brutus became something of a local celebrity. The county newspaper sent a photographer to capture the heroic Ram. Children from the nearby elementary school drew pictures of him during art class. Someone even created a Brutus fan club t-shirt that sold surprisingly well at the general store. On a crisp autumn morning, exactly 3 months after the infamous incident, John unveiled something special. With help from the community, he'd mounted a small bronze plaque near the fence. It read, "Here Brutus defended justice against tyranny, September 2024. The dedication ceremony drew the whole town. Even some former HOA supporters attended, sheepishly admitting they'd learned an important lesson about community versus control. Children played on hay bales while adults shared potluck dishes and laughed about the great fence fiasco. As the sun set that evening, John stood with his family, looking at their ranch with new eyes. The fence wasn't just a boundary anymore. It had become a symbol of standing up for what's right. His wife squeezed his hand as Brutus grazed peacefully nearby, occasionally looking up as if wondering what all the fuss was about. The story of the HOA, the gun, and the ram became part of local folklore. Years later, newcomers to town would hear the tale over coffee at the diner, each telling adding a little more embellishment. But the core message remained. Sometimes the most unlikely heroes come on woolly legs, and community disputes are best solved with compassion rather than weapons. Time seemed to slow down as Brutus thundered across the pasture toward them. The massive ram's woolly coat rippled with each powerful stride, his curled horns catching the last rays of sunlight. Greg's eyes went wide as the charging animal approached, and instinctively, he turned the weapon toward what he perceived as the immediate threat. "Drop the weapon," John shouted, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Greg hesitated, caught between pointing the gun at John and the oncoming ram. In that moment of confusion, Brutus reached them. The ram, excited by the prospect of extra treats, had no idea about the serious situation unfolding. He simply wanted to greet everyone in his usual enthusiastic way. With the force of a battering ram, quite literally, Brutus struck Greg in the legs. The impact happened so fast that neither man had time to react. Greg's feet flew out from under him, his arms flailing wildly through the air. The weapon slipped from his grasp, spinning in a dangerous arc through the fading daylight. For a heart-stopping moment, The metal object hovered in the air, glinting ominously. Then, with a splash that echoed across the quiet ranch, it landed harmlessly into a nearby bale of hay. Greg's body followed a more spectacular trajectory. The momentum from Brutus's charge sent the HOA board member stumbling backward. His polished loafers found no grip on the dusty ground as he lost his balance completely. Behind him, the large horse trough that John had filled that morning waited like a liquid landing pad. The splash was enormous. Water exploded in all directions as Greg crashed into the trough bottom first. His clipboard floated on the surface, papers turning soggy and ink bleeding into watery swirls. His measuring tape sank to the bottom like a coiled snake. Brutus, satisfied with his reunion greeting, trotted over to where John stood frozen in shock. The ram nudged John's hand gently, looking up with innocent eyes, as if asking for his usual evening treats. Meanwhile, Greg sputtered and coughed, still sitting waist-deep in the trough like a child who'd fallen into a puddle. The ranch fell silent again, except for the sound of water dripping from Greg's soaked clothes. His once crisp white shirt now clung to his body, and his dark pants squished when he tried to move. His glasses sat crooked on his face, water droplets magnifying his shocked expression. Posey emerged from his hiding spot near the barn, foam still clutched in his hand. He'd managed to dial emergency services just as the chaos erupted. The distant sound of approaching sirens began to wail, growing louder with each passing second. John slowly approached the hay bale where the weapon had landed. With careful movements, he reached into the hay and retrieved it, keeping the barrel pointed safely toward the ground. The metal felt heavy and cold in his palm, a stark reminder of how quickly a simple fence dispute had escalated into something far more serious. The sirens grew louder as police cruisers bounced along the gravel road leading to John's ranch. Dust clouds swirled in their headlights, creating a dramatic scene against the darkening sky. Sheriff Daniels stepped out first, his weathered face immediately taking in the bizarre sight before him. Greg sat shivering in the horse trough, his designer clothes ruined and his pride clearly wounded. Water dripped steadily from his sleeves as he clutched his soggy clipboard to his chest like a shield. Brutus munched contentedly on some hay nearby, completely unaware of the chaos he caused. "Evening, John," Sheriff Daniels said, tipping his hat. He'd known John since high school, when they'd both been on the football team. Joe's called about a disturbance involving a weapon. John carefully handed over the firearm. "Greg here brought this onto my property. He was measuring my fence without permission when things got heated." The sheriff examined the weapon before securing it safely. "Anyone hurt?" "Just my dignity," Greg muttered from the trough, attempting to climb out. His loafers squished with each movement, and his hair stuck to his forehead in wet strands. At that moment, the mail carrier, Mrs. Peterson, pulled up in her postal truck. She'd been checking her route one last time, something she did every evening to ensure nothing got missed. The usually punctual woman had a reputation for being in the right place at the right time. "Sheriff, I saw everything," she exclaimed, rushing over. "I was delivering late packages to the dairy farm when I heard shouting. I watched that man," she pointed at Greg, pull out a weapon and threaten John. Thomas appeared from across the road, having heard the commotion from his evening milking. The old farmer still wore his work overalls covered in dried milk stains. "Can confirm that," he added, joining the gathering crowd. "Been watching from my fence line. Saw the whole standoff. That city fella threatened my neighbor with a gun over a simple fence." Sheriff Daniels turned to his deputy, who was recording everything with a notepad. "Make sure you get all the witness statements. John, you mentioned having security cameras." "Yes, sir, just installed them last month after those strange cars kept coming around." John led the sheriff to the hidden camera mounted on the barn's corner. The angle captured everything. Greg trespassing, the confrontation, the weapon being drawn, and Brutus's unexpected intervention. As they reviewed the footage on the small screen, even the stern sheriff couldn't hide a slight grin when Brutus made contact. "Well, that's definitely going in the incident report," he chuckled. Greg was helped out of the trough by the deputy, his expensive shoes making embarrassing squelching sounds with each step. Mud streaked his face where he tried to wipe away water, making him look more like a mischievous child than a threatening board member. Gregory Hutchins, Sheriff Daniels announced officially, "You're under arrest for trespassing on private property and assault with a deadly weapon." The Miranda rights echoed across the quiet ranch as handcuffs clicked into place. John's phone buzzed with text messages from neighbors who'd heard the sirens. Word traveled fast in their small community. Some expressed concern, others supported him, and a few shared photos they'd taken of the police cars outside his property. The fence dispute had officially become the talk of the town. The September heat hit the ranch like a heavy blanket when John returned from town that Thursday afternoon. He'd been at the local hardware store buying supplies for storm season, chatting with old friends about everything except the fence dispute. Sometimes avoiding the drama felt better than facing it head-on. As his truck rumbled up the gravel driveway, something felt off. The horses were acting restless, and the sheep had gathered in an unusual cluster near the southern pasture. Then he saw it. Greg's silver sedan parked right beside his wooden fence, door hanging open as if its owner had left in a hurry. John parked and stepped out, dust swirling around his boots. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He grabbed his hat from the passenger seat, took a deep breath, and headed toward the commotion. Greg was there, wearing his usual crisp white shirt and dark pants, looking wildly out of place against the rustic backdrop. He had a measuring tape stretched against the fence posts, muttering numbers under his breath while scribbling on his ever-present clipboard. His black loafers had mud caked on the sides. He'd clearly been walking through the pasture. "Can I help you with something?" John called out, trying to keep his voice steadied, despite the anger bubbling inside him. Greg startled, nearly dropping his clipboard. He straightened up, adjusting his glasses with trembling fingers. "I'm conducting an official measurement for the HOA records," he announced, holding up his clipboard like a shield. "You've ignored our warnings long enough." "This is private property," John replied, walking closer. "You need permission to be here." Greg's face reddened. "I have every right to inspect potential violations. The HOA bylaws clearly state." "I don't care what your papers say," John interrupted, his patience wearing thin. "You're trespassing. I'm asking you nicely to leave." The two men stood facing each other, the evening air heavy with tension. Somewhere in the distance, a cow lowed, and cicadas hummed their endless summer song. The fence that had started this whole mess stood between them now, a wooden barrier that had come to represent so much more than property boundaries. Greg gathered his measuring tape with jerky movements, wrapping it clumsily around its case. "Fine," he spat, "but this isn't over. I'm filing a formal complaint tomorrow morning." As Greg turned to leave, John heard the soft whistle of a bird, their ranch hand Jose's warning signal. Something wasn't right. The hairs on the back of John's neck stood up as he noticed Greg's hand hovering near his waist, beneath his untucked shirt. "Sir," Jose called from the barn. "Everything okay out there?" The question hung in the air as Greg froze halfway to his car. The peaceful sounds of the ranch suddenly seemed too quiet, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. John's throat tightened as he remembered the stories he'd heard about Greg's concealed carry permit application last month at the county office. The conversation had seemed innocent then, just small talk over coffee. But now, with Greg's hand resting suspiciously at his waist, everything took on a darker meaning.